This program contains content that may disturb some viewers.
Has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
I have asked Robert McNamara to assume the responsibilities of Secretary of Defense, and I'm glad and happy to say that he has accepted this responsibility.
This month marks the 65th anniversary of the world's closest encounter with total annihilation. Many remember the Cuban Missile Crisis as a terrifying 13 days in 1962, in which the concept of mutually assured destruction was pushed to the absolute limit. Heated tension, which is evident throughout the Cold War, reached its peak in the Cuban Missile Crisis, with world superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union, ready to destroy entire nations at the push of a button. To commemorate this event, Four Corners has been fortunate enough to have interviewed the former US Secretary of Defense and close advisor to President John F. Kennedy during the crisis, Robert McNamara.
Welcome to the program, Mr. McNamara.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, it must have been extremely stressful being the Secretary of Defense during the crisis and deciding the fate of millions.
Well, yes, it was. Coming straight from being the president of the Ford Motor Company to being responsible for, as you said, millions of lives did earn me a few more grey hairs.
I'm sure it did. So what was your initial reaction when you discovered the Soviets had nuclear missiles placed in Cuba that were in range of Washington, D.C.?
When I first became United States Secretary of Defense in 1961, I was so bewildered by the fact that two massive powers, through the control of a few individuals, could annihilate entire nations via nuclear war. I was so bewildered by the fact that these few powerful individuals could dispute to the extent that nuclear war was almost imminent, and yet they seemed ignorant to their ability to wipe each other off the face of the earth. Thus, I presented my ironic concept of mutually assured destruction. This clearly explained that due to potential cataclysmic destruction that retaliation would cause, both world powers should be deterred from initiating nuclear warfare. I was aware that my policy remained controversial, but I believe it did make some contribution in scaring major powers into avoiding total self-destruction.
It's interesting you mentioned controversy. Can you talk us through the different perspectives of the decisions made or proposed during the crisis?
Well, my perspective of it was I was just trying to keep America out of nuclear war. I knew that if we entered, nations would be destroyed, whether it was ours, the USSR, Cuba or others. People in charge were telling me that we should go in there and totally destroy Cuba, but I knew that that shouldn't happen. As I said before, nuclear weapons will destroy nations, and if we used them on Cuba, Cuba would have been completely destroyed. Every military commander who is honest with himself and others will admit he has made mistakes with military power. He has killed people, but he hasn't destroyed nations. Everyone should learn from their mistakes, but you can't with nuclear weapons. If you make one mistake, you destroy nations. That wasn't something I wanted to be responsible for. Major voices in America were telling me that we should invade Cuba, but I knew that was going to end badly. If the USSR nuclear missiles that were in Cuba were launched for whatever reason, in this case our troops invading Cuba, 90 million American civilian lives would be affected. Innocent lives. This was something we could not risk. I didn't want to enter it because I knew so many lives would be lost, and the world would never be the same again. It would change for the worst.
Despite others wanting to use nuclear weapons, each of the powers managed to bring a peaceful end to the crisis. So what measures were undertaken in order to avoid nuclear war, and how was the crisis resolved?
Well, on October 16, 1962, images of long-range Soviet missiles in Cuba were obtained by the US. If these missiles were launched, it would reach any part of the US, causing massive destruction. After these images were seen by President Kennedy, he announced to the public the initiation of American blockades. These naval boats would prevent the Soviet Union from delivering any more armed weapons to Cuba. In his speech, he also stated if any Cuban missiles were to be launched in the Western Hemisphere, the US would conduct a full retaliatory strike upon the Soviet Union. The blockades were proven effective, but there were still obvious rising tensions between the two nations. On the 27th of October, Khrushchev offered Kennedy a deal. If we were to remove all nuclear missiles from Turkey, then the Soviet Union would do the same with Cuba. Kennedy was keen to take the deal, but he didn't want the public to know of Khrushchev's demands. Instead, Kennedy set up a meeting to negotiate with the Soviets. In the end, they agreed that as long as it remained a secret, the US would remove the missiles in Turkey. The Soviet Union agreed to the proposal, and afterwards President Kennedy announced to the public that the US would remove blockades and refrain from invading Cuba, as long as the Soviets removed all its missiles.
Thank you for lending us your time, Mr. McNamara.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this very insightful episode of Four Corners. Please visit our website for more information on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Good night.